California's elite was shaken when the body of 13-year-old John Maxwell was found floating near the pier. A boy born into wealth and privilege, his life should have been one of security. Instead, it ended in the cold waters beneath the city. The discovery of John Maxwell's body sent shockwaves through San Francisco's wealthiest circles. 13 years old, a bright future ahead of him, a name that carried weight in the city's elite. Yet, there he was, floating near the dock in the early morning light. A boy who should have been safe. A boy who should have been home. Before we get into this case, if you're fascinated by true crime and the untold stories that shake communities to their core, make sure to subscribe. This is one case you won't forget. The death of 13-year-old John Maxwell was not just another case. It was not just another tragedy lost in the pages of a newspaper. It was the kind of case that made people stop, whisper, question everything they thought they knew about the world they lived in. From the moment his body was found near the pier, nothing about it made sense. A boy from a wealthy family, a boy with no history of trouble, no reason to be near the water that night. Yet there he was, floating just beyond the dock, the cold waves lapping against him, as if trying to return something that never belonged there in the first place. At first, there were no answers, no witnesses, just silence. His family mourned, his school held vigils, and the media painted a picture of an unfortunate accident. The initial response was cautious. Authorities arrived, marked off the area, and began their work. At first, there were theories. Runaway, misstep, an accident perhaps. But the closer they looked, the harder those explanations became to believe. His clothes, neatly worn, no signs of a struggle. His shoes, both still on, laces tied perfectly. His body, positioned, not abandoned. The evidence was speaking, even when no one else would. The autopsy revealed something the initial reports didn't. There was no water in John's lungs. He hadn't drowned. He had been dead before his body touched the water. The bruising around his neck told a different story, one that led investigators away from the idea of an accident. This was intentional, deliberate. Someone had done this to him. The question was, who? Had John discovered something? Had he threatened to tell? John Maxwell had not drowned. That much was certain. He had been placed there after the fact, and if that was true, it meant something else. It meant someone had been with him in his final moments. Someone had made sure he would never speak again. This was no longer a case of an unfortunate accident. It was something else entirely. And as investigators started asking questions, it became clear that the answers would not come easily. John had last been seen hours before his body was found. He had left his family's estate that evening, telling them he would be back soon. He never returned. The last confirmed sighting of him was on a security camera outside an address few would have questioned at the time. A house he had been to many times before. A place that was supposed to be safe. He was seen walking through the gates of a private estate. He was never seen walking out. The hours between his arrival and the discovery of his body remained unaccounted for. The cameras that monitored the estate, usually recording without fail, had gaps in the footage. Pieces of time missing. Calls made to his phone during those hours went unanswered. Texts left unread. And the one person who could have explained it all had little to say. The people closest to him were questioned. Family, friends, employees of the estate. But the statements didn't align. Timelines had inconsistencies. Answers were vague. Some hesitated to speak at all. Why would a 13-year-old boy vanish for hours before being found in the water? Why did surveillance footage of that night have missing time? Why did those who should have known the most seem so reluctant to talk? Days passed. Then weeks. The case that had seemed so open and shut had become something else entirely. Something tangled, complicated, something that suggested there was more to this story than anyone wanted to admit. And then, there was a break. A detail buried in phone records, a message recovered from a deleted conversation, a lead that took detectives in a direction no one had expected. What they found would change everything. But it would also raise a far more terrifying question. Had John Maxwell's death been the first, or just the first to be discovered? The question also wasn't just how John Maxwell had died. It was why. The air was crisp that morning, the kind that makes your breath visible in soft white clouds. The fishermen had arrived at the dock before dawn, as they always did, their boots thudding against the wooden planks. The city's skyline was beginning to stir in the distance, a faint glow of gold and violet breaking over the horizon. The tide was unusually low, revealing patches of jagged rock that were normally hidden beneath the water's surface. The first fisherman to notice something unusual was a man named Hector Ruiz. He had worked these waters for over 2 decades, hauling in nets long before the city's wealthiest residents woke in their penthouse apartments. But that morning, something stopped him cold. At first, he thought it was just a bundle of fabric, tangled in the water near one of the dock's support beams. A discarded jacket, maybe, but as he stepped closer, the shape became more distinct. The outline of a hand, an arm, a body. Hector called out to the others, his voice sharp with alarm. Within moments, 3 other fishermen gathered around, peering down at the lifeless figure floating just beneath the surface. The body was small, too small, a child. Someone gasped. Another crossed himself. No one spoke for a moment. Then, one of them pulled out a phone and dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens slicing through the stillness of the early morning. Officer Daniel Kim was one of the first on the scene, stepping out of his patrol car just as the first rays of sunlight touched the dock. He had seen his share of drownings. San Francisco's waters had claimed many lives over the years. But something about this one felt different. The boy was pulled from the water with the utmost care, his body limp and pale. He was dressed in a dark sweater and jeans, his shoes still on his feet. No visible signs of trauma at first glance. Just the eerie stillness of a life cut short. There was a quiet murmur among the officers as they examined him more closely. The lack of bloating, the condition of the skin. This wasn't a body that had been in the water for long. He hadn't been adrift for days. More likely, just hours. One of the detectives knelt beside the boy, brushing wet strands of hair away from his forehead. And then the most unsettling discovery of all. There was no water in his mouth or nose. No sign that he had drowned. Officer Kim exhaled sharply. This wasn't an accidental drowning. This wasn't a case of a child wandering too close to the edge and slipping in. This was something else, and whoever had left him there had wanted it to look like an accident. As standard protocol, missing person reports were checked against the boy's description. It didn't take long for a match to come through. The officers exchanged glances as the name lit up the screen. John Maxwell, the son of a wealthy, influential family, a name that carried weight in the city's highest circles. This was no ordinary case. Detective Valerie Pierce, one of the lead investigators on the scene, stared down at the boy's still form. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a case of a child lost to the sea. This was a crime, a deliberate act. Someone had done this to him. The news spread quickly. The headlines the next morning speculated wildly. Tragic accident, son of prominent tech family found dead in bay. Mysterious death of John Maxwell, what happened that night? Public speculation ran rampant. Some whispered that the boy had wandered off alone, gotten too close to the edge. Others wondered if it had been a suicide, a troubled young boy carrying a secret burden. But the police weren't convinced. Not by a long shot. The positioning of the body, the condition of his clothes, the eerie absence of water in his lungs, it didn't add up. And when the autopsy results came in, any lingering doubts were erased. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the forensic pathologist assigned to the case, performed the autopsy that same afternoon. The results were chilling. John Maxwell had not drowned. That much was now fact. The bruising around his neck told a different story, one of force, of struggle. The pattern was distinct, consistent with manual strangulation. Whoever had killed him had done so with their own hands. There were additional signs of trauma, small abrasions on his wrists, as if he had been restrained, faint bruising on his arms and torso, suggesting a struggle had taken place. But what stood out most was something even more disturbing. There were older bruises, faded marks along his ribs, his back, the kind that weren't the result of a single, isolated attack. These were signs of something that had been happening over time. And that meant one thing. Whoever had done this to John had hurt him before. Detective Pierce sat in silence after reading the full report. Her hands tightened into fists. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't an accident or a moment of blind rage. This was personal. Whoever had done this had known John Maxwell, and they had wanted him gone. The next step was clear. They needed to retrace John's final hours. Where had he been? Who had seen him last? And most importantly, who had the most to lose if John Maxwell had lived to tell his story? What detectives uncovered next would send shockwaves through the city's elite and expose a secret darker than anyone could have imagined. John Maxwell was the kind of child people described as going places. At just 13, he had the poise and confidence of someone far beyond his years. Teachers at his elite private school often remarked on his intelligence, his natural curiosity. He was the type of student who asked the right questions, the kind that made adults take notice. He had a love for technology, a passion he had inherited from his family. His father, Daniel Maxwell, was a respected software engineer. His uncle, Richard Sterling, was a billionaire, one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley. John was the kind of kid who could have done anything with his future, but his future had been stolen. And now, people were left asking, who would have wanted to take it from him? The Maxwells were no ordinary family. Their wealth stretched back for generations, the map tied to old money and new tech. They were the kind of people who didn't just live in the city, they owned pieces of it. John had grown up in luxury. He had never wanted for anything, at least not in the way most people did. His childhood had been filled with extravagant vacations, private tutors, elite social circles. But behind the polished image, there were cracks in the foundation. Those who knew John well said that, in the months leading up to his death, something had changed. He had become quieter, more withdrawn. There were times he seemed distracted, almost nervous. And then there were the times he had disappeared. John had always been close with his uncle, Richard Sterling. The billionaire had taken an interest in him from a young age, mentoring him, introducing him to the world of business. But in the days before his death, John had told a friend something chilling. "There are things you don't know about him," he had said. "If people knew the truth, it would destroy everything." Richard Sterling wasn't just any billionaire. He was a man who had built his empire from the ground up. The founder of Sterling Dynamics, one of the most powerful tech firms in the country, he had been called a visionary, a genius. His name carried weight. To the world, he was the embodiment of success. A philanthropist, a man who gave millions to charities, who spoke at elite conferences, who dined with world leaders. To John, he was something else entirely. From the time John was little, Richard had taken a special interest in him. More than just an uncle, he had been a mentor, a guide. He had given John access to a world most kids could only dream of. Trips on private jets, backstage passes to exclusive events, expensive gifts, a kind of attention that most boys his age would have killed for. But some people had started to question just how close they really were. Family members had whispered about it over the years. The way Richard always seemed to have time for John, even when he was too busy for anyone else. The way he always made sure John had the best of everything. And then there were the times John would come home from his uncle's estate, looking different, quieter, uneasy. There were moments when he seemed to shrink away at the sound of Richard's name, flinching at things that should have been harmless. Something wasn't right. And then, there was the night John disappeared. The security footage was the key. The last confirmed sighting of John Maxwell was recorded at 7:42 p.m. on the night of his death. A grainy video from a security camera near the entrance of Richard Sterling's sprawling mansion. It showed John walking up the long driveway, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't alone. A black SUV had dropped him off. The door to the estate opened before he even knocked, and then, he stepped inside. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. What happened inside that house? And why, if nothing was wrong, was there no footage of him leaving? Richard Sterling was a name synonymous with innovation, power, and immense wealth. He was the man behind Sterling Tech, a billion-dollar empire specializing in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and cutting-edge software solutions. To the public, he was a genius, a self-made billionaire who had built his company from the ground up. His rise to success had been meteoric, his influence stretching far beyond the tech industry. Politicians sought his advice on cybersecurity policies. Universities invited him to speak about the future of AI. Philanthropic organizations praised his generosity, with his name appearing on hospital wings, research centers, and scholarships. He was the embodiment of the American dream. But behind the polished image, behind the staged press appearances and carefully curated social media presence, there were whispers, rumors, stories that never quite made it to the headlines. Because for all his brilliance, Richard Sterling was also a man surrounded by mystery. To the world, Richard was a visionary, a man who gave millions to charity, spoke about ethical technology, and championed the next generation of innovators. But those who worked closest to him told a different story. Former employees described him as brilliant but ruthless, a perfectionist who demanded absolute loyalty. He had been known to fire employees for minor mistakes, blacklist competitors, and destroy anyone who threatened his company's success. Some called him controlling, others called him paranoid. He rarely allowed anyone into his personal life. His estate was heavily guarded, with state-of-the-art security systems that made it nearly impenetrable. His social interactions were carefully controlled. Business meetings, high-profile events, and only a select few trusted individuals ever saw him in a truly private setting. One thing was clear. Richard Sterling was not a man who trusted easily, and he was certainly not a man who tolerated secrets. Richard Sterling's name had never been officially attached to any scandal. But if you asked the right people, if you dug deep enough, there were stories. Former employees spoke of his temper. He was known for explosive outbursts, fits of rage that would send entire departments scrambling. One ex-employee, who had left the company abruptly, described an unsettling encounter in a leaked email. "I saw something that night. Something I wasn't supposed to see. And the next day, I was fired." There were rumors of NDAs and hushed payouts. Sterling Tech had settled multiple lawsuits over the years, but the details were always sealed. The official reasons? Workplace disputes, intellectual property conflicts. But some suspected the real reasons were far more sinister. There were whispers about his personal life. A few tabloids had hinted at affairs, strange relationships, young men and women who entered his life briefly and then disappeared without a trace. But these stories never gained traction, likely buried under legal threats and powerful connections. And then, there was the Maxwell family connection. John Maxwell wasn't just some random child who had crossed paths with Sterling. He was family. Sterling had been John's uncle, not by blood but by marriage. John's mother, Claire Maxwell, was the younger sister of Richard Sterling's late wife, Julia. Julia Sterling had died in a tragic car accident years earlier, a fact that the media rarely revisited. What was known was that Richard had been devastated by her loss. Some said he had never truly recovered, withdrawing further into his own world after her passing. Even before her death, John had spent time at Sterling's estate. It wasn't unusual. He was the son of a high-profile family, and their circles often overlapped. To most, it seemed like nothing more than a close family bond. Richard was family. He was a role model, a guiding hand in the boy's life. But now, detectives were beginning to wonder, was there more to their relationship than anyone had realized? As detectives dug deeper, they found something disturbing. John had stayed overnight at Sterling's mansion multiple times. He had been seen leaving his uncle's office late at night, long after official meetings should have ended. And the messages, detectives discovered text messages between John and Richard. The language was strange. Some of the messages felt inappropriate for an uncle and nephew. Why had John spent so much time at Sterling's estate? Why had Sterling been so involved in the boy's life? And what exactly had John discovered before his death? When investigators approached Richard Sterling for questioning, he was calm. Almost too calm. He had an airtight alibi. The night John disappeared, Sterling had been attending a high-profile charity gala in downtown San Francisco. There were hundreds of witnesses, photographs, and even live-streamed video footage of him at the event. He had arrived at 7:45 p.m., shaken hands with important guests, and delivered a speech at 9 p.m. about the future of AI in law enforcement. At 10:30 p.m., he was seen on camera, chatting with a group of investors. And at 11:15 p.m., he left the gala in his luxury sedan, escorted by his personal driver. On paper, it was perfect. If he had been at the gala the entire time, he couldn't have been involved in John's death. Could he? At first, detectives were frustrated. The alibi was solid, every timestamp checked out. But then, something caught their attention. Security footage from a traffic camera near the Maxwell estate showed a black luxury car matching the description of Sterling's vehicle at 10:58 p.m., less than 15 minutes before he was seen at the gala. That didn't make sense. The estate was at least a 30-minute drive from the event. How could he be in two places at once? Unless he had left the gala earlier than he claimed. Unless the footage at the gala had been carefully staged, pre-recorded or selectively edited to make it seem as though he had never left. Unless someone had helped him create a perfect alibi. But when detectives searched his mansion, they found something chilling. With growing suspicions, the police obtained a warrant to search Richard Sterling's estate. The moment they stepped inside, something felt off. The house was immaculate, almost too perfect. The floors gleamed, the air smelled of cleaning chemicals, and the staff seemed on edge. Then, they reached the guest room, and that's when they found it. Something so disturbing, so incriminating, that it would change the course of the entire investigation. But the biggest question remained. Was John Maxwell really Richard Sterling's only victim? The Maxwell estate stood like a fortress on the city's northern hills, its towering gates and manicured hedges, hiding the kind of secrets only the wealthy could afford to keep. When detectives arrived with a search warrant, the air was thick with tension. The housekeeper, a woman in her 50s with trembling hands, opened the door but wouldn't meet their eyes. The butler, an older man with years of quiet service under his belt, was tight-lipped. It was clear the household staff had been instructed to say as little as possible. But the police weren't there to talk. They were there to look. John Maxwell had last been seen alive walking through these very gates. Somewhere inside this house lay the truth about his final moments. And it didn't take long for the first cracks to appear. In the grand foyer, everything was pristine. Too pristine. The house smelled of freshly polished wood and industrial-grade disinfectant, as if someone had spent hours scrubbing it down. The cleaning staff, when questioned, confirmed that an unusual deep cleaning had taken place the morning after John's disappearance. Rugs had been shampooed, furniture wiped down, and bedding replaced. It was standard practice, the butler insisted. A routine cleaning. But when detectives checked the security system, they found something far more troubling. The estate had state-of-the-art surveillance, high-resolution cameras positioned at every entrance and hallway. But when investigators accessed the footage from the night John disappeared, key portions were missing. Specifically, the hours between 8:30 p.m. and 2 a.m., the exact window in which John was last seen alive. Someone had deleted the footage. And that could only mean one thing. There was something in those missing hours that someone didn't want the police to see. As detectives moved deeper into the house, they focused on one particular area, the East Wing. It was an area rarely used, according to staff. The guest rooms there were for visitors, but none had stayed overnight in weeks. At first glance, the rooms seemed untouched. But in one of them, behind a heavy oak door that stuck slightly when pushed, they found something unusual. The bed had been stripped, fresh sheets neatly folded in the closet. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising, however, was what forensic specialists found beneath the new linens. A faint, partial handprint on the wooden bedpost. Scratch marks, small but distinct, etched into the polished wood near the headboard. The kind of scratches that didn't happen by accident. The kind made by fingernails. Someone had struggled here. And it wasn't just the bed that raised alarms. Under blacklight examination, traces of what appeared to be skin cells and fibers were found embedded in the mattress seams. Tiny, nearly invisible to the naked eye. But damning, someone had been in this room recently, and they hadn't left willingly. Then came the biggest discovery yet. Tucked away in the back of a nightstand drawer, hidden beneath a stack of unused writing paper, was a phone. Not just any phone. A burner. A cheap, disposable device that left no paper trail. The screen was dark, the battery nearly dead, but when detectives plugged it in and powered it on, the messages told a chilling story. You promised. I know, but things changed. If you don't fix this, I will. Don't do anything stupid. I'm done waiting. If you won't tell them, I will. The last message was timestamped just hours before John was last seen alive. Who had been using this phone? And what was the secret John had threatened to expose? The answer came in the form of a second chilling discovery. In a drawer of a desk, locked but easily picked open, detectives found a collection of journals. Notebooks filled with meticulously handwritten entries, some dating back years. The name John appeared again and again in the pages. The writing was obsessive, almost frantic. Descriptions of moments shared in private, mentions of gifts, secrets, and a growing fear that John would ruin everything. And then, a final entry, written just days before his disappearance. He's asking too many questions. He's getting too close. If he talks, it's over. Whoever wrote this had been spiraling, losing control, and they had decided to silence John Maxwell before he could say another word. The evidence was stacking up. The burner phone, the journals, the missing security footage. But detectives weren't prepared for what they would find next, because when they decrypted the deleted messages from the phone, they uncovered a secret so dark, so explosive, it would shake the entire city to its core. The journals, the burner phone, the missing footage, all of it painted a disturbing picture. But it wasn't until forensic analysts decrypted the deleted messages that investigators uncovered the horrifying truth behind John Maxwell's death. Richard Sterling, the powerful and respected tech billionaire, had been hiding something so sinister that if it ever became public, it would destroy everything he had built. And John had been the key to it all. The recovered messages revealed a private world that no one outside of Sterling's mansion had ever known existed. At first glance, they could have been mistaken for exchanges between a mentor and his protege, words of encouragement, inside jokes, promises of gifts and trips. But as the messages progressed, a darker pattern emerged. You know you're special to me. No one else understands me the way you do. Then why do you act weird in public, like you don't even know me? You know why. It has to be our secret. I don't like this, it feels wrong. Don't say that. You know how much I care about you. If you tell anyone, it will ruin everything. Do you want that? The texts showed a clear pattern. Sterling had been grooming John, manipulating him, creating a bond that blurred the lines between trust and control. There were messages about expensive gifts, watches, sneakers, designer clothes, promises of trips abroad, exclusive parties, an internship at his company when John was older. But the most disturbing messages came in the days leading up to John's disappearance. I don't want to do this anymore. You don't mean that. You're just confused. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about. I'm telling my parents. Don't be stupid, John. Think about what will happen. To you, to me, to everyone. And then the final message. I don't care anymore. I'm telling them tonight. It had been sent at 7:43 p.m. on the night of his disappearance. John Maxwell never lived to see the morning. Investigators pieced together a timeline of John's relationship with Sterling. It had started years earlier, small moments, seemingly harmless gestures, disguised as mentorship. Richard had been a close family. He had taken John under his wing, promising to teach him about business, technology, and the world beyond his privileged upbringing. But as time passed, the relationship grew more intense. Private dinners, weekend trips, one-on-one meetings that excluded even John's parents. And then, the gifts. John's friends later told investigators that he would often come to school wearing things he couldn't have bought himself. A Rolex, a brand new iPhone before it was even released to the public, sneakers that were only sold in limited quantities to celebrities. When they asked where he got them, John would just shrug. He likes to give me stuff, he'd say. But Richard Sterling wasn't just giving John gifts, he was buying his silence. Experts who analyzed the case noted the textbook signs of grooming. Richard had isolated John from his peers, made him feel like he was the only one who truly understood him. He convinced John that their relationship was special, one psychologist later explained, that no one else would understand, and most importantly, that if John ever told anyone, it would ruin both of their lives. The text supported this theory. If you tell them they'll hate you, they won't understand. They'll think you're lying, they'll say you made it all up. And if they do believe you, they'll take everything away from me. I'll go to prison. My company will collapse. Do you really want that on your conscience? Richard Sterling wasn't just manipulating John emotionally. He was making him responsible for keeping the secret. For a long time, it worked. Until it didn't. Something shifted in the weeks leading up to John's death. His texts became colder, shorter. He started ignoring Richard's calls. And then came the final confrontation. According to forensic analysis, John had visited Sterling's mansion on the night he disappeared. He had walked through the gates willingly. Security footage, even with the missing portions, confirmed it. But what happened next was pieced together through text records, witness statements, and forensic evidence from inside the house. John confronted Richard. He told him he was done, that he was going to tell his parents everything, and Richard panicked. If John talked, his life was over. His billion-dollar empire would crumble. The media would devour him. He would be arrested. So he made a choice, a sickening, desperate choice. He couldn't let John leave that house alive. But how did he cover it up? The murder itself was brutal, personal. John Maxwell didn't die quickly. The struggle marks in the guest room, the scratches on the bedpost, the bruising on his neck. He fought back, but Richard was bigger, stronger, more desperate. When it was over, Richard was left with the unthinkable. A lifeless body, a secret that could never be exposed, and a new problem. How do you make a 13-year-old boy disappear without a trace? What happened in the hours after John's death would prove to be just as chilling as the crime itself. Because Richard Sterling wasn't just a murderer. He was a man who knew how to cover his tracks. From the moment John Maxwell's body was discovered, Richard Sterling, the billionaire tech CEO and John's uncle, had played the role of the grieving relative flawlessly. The morning news was flooded with images of him standing outside his estate, eyes red, lips pressed into a firm line, as cameras captured his solemn expression. He spoke of John's bright future, his kindness, his innocence. He called for justice, demanded the police find whoever was responsible for this horrific act. But behind the scenes, Richard Sterling wasn't grieving. He was working. He knew how this would play out. He had money, influence, power, and he was determined to make sure the investigation led anywhere but back to him. When detectives first questioned him, his story was simple. He had been at a charity gala that evening, an event packed with high-profile guests. He had left the party late, driven straight home, and gone to bed. He hadn't seen John that night. The last time they spoke was a few days prior. It was an airtight alibi, or so he thought. But what Richard didn't count on was that no matter how much money or power he had, lies always have a way of unraveling. To solidify his alibi, Richard relied on those closest to him, his staff, the housekeeper, the butler, his personal driver. Each one, when questioned, had the same response. Yes, Mr. Sterling was at the gala. No, he wasn't home until well after midnight. No, they never saw John that evening. But detectives weren't just relying on testimony, they were looking at the evidence. And the evidence was starting to tell a very different story. The missing surveillance footage from the mansion was an immediate red flag. Richard's estate had one of the most advanced security systems in the city. Motion-activated cameras in every hallway, every entrance, every room except the bathrooms. But when detectives reviewed the recordings from the night John disappeared, they found hours of footage mysteriously missing. 8:30 p.m. to 2 a.m., gone. No backup files, no server copies. Just an empty gap where evidence should have been. Richard's legal team was quick to dismiss it. A technical glitch, they called it. An unfortunate system failure. But there was one problem. The software running Richard's surveillance cameras? It was developed by his own company, which meant he had the ability to alter or erase the footage anytime he wanted. And if he was innocent, why would he need to? While investigators worked behind the scenes, Richard's public relations team was doing everything possible to shape the story. They fed headlines to news outlets, painting John's death as a tragic accident. They released carefully worded statements, highlighting John's occasional reckless behavior and subtly implying that he may have been involved in something dangerous. They leaked old disciplinary records from John's school, a fight he got into at 12 years old, a single detention for skipping class. To build the narrative that maybe, just maybe, John wasn't the innocent victim people thought he was. And for a while it worked. The public began to question. Was John hiding something? Had he been involved in something risky? Could his death have been a result of his own choices? Richard's media machine was doing its job, but no amount of PR spin could erase the truth. Because as carefully as Richard had covered his tracks, he had made one fatal mistake. For weeks, the investigation seemed stalled. Then, a break. A maid who worked at the estate came forward. At first, she had been too afraid to speak. Richard was powerful. He had connections in every corner of the city. But the guilt was too much. And what she knew? It changed everything. The night of John's disappearance, she had been at the mansion much later than she should have been. She had been asked to leave early, like most of the staff. But she had forgotten her purse. And when she quietly snuck back in to retrieve it from the laundry room, she heard something she would never forget. Screams. A young boy's voice, muffled, desperate. And then, silence. She had barely dared to breathe. She stayed hidden for 10 minutes, 15. Then, when she was sure the house was silent again, she grabbed her purse and ran. She told no one, until now. And once detectives had her statement, they knew Richard's story was a lie, but they still needed hard proof. That proof came in the form of GPS data. Richard had insisted he was nowhere near the crime scene that night, but detectives pulled data from his car's onboard system. And what they found? Richard's car had been at the waterfront, the exact location where John's body was found, between 1:30 and 2 a.m., just enough time to dispose of a body. Still, one question remained. If Richard had killed John inside the mansion, why wasn't there more physical evidence? The answer lay in his financial records. Detectives combed through his bank statements, looking for anything unusual. And there it was. A large payment. $50,000, wired to a private cleaning service. A service that specialized in crime scene cleanup. The cover-up had been intricate, calculated, and for a while, it almost worked. But with the maid's testimony, the GPS data, and the financial trail, the police had enough. They were ready to make an arrest. And when they finally confronted Richard Sterling, his reaction would be something no one could have predicted. The sun had barely risen over San Francisco when police arrived at the Sterling Tower, a high-rise luxury building where Richard Sterling owned the entire top floor. It was an address known only to the elite, a penthouse worth over $20 million, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. But on this morning, that view was the least of Sterling's concerns. Detectives weren't coming with questions. They were coming with an arrest warrant. Inside, Richard Sterling was sitting in his private office, sipping his morning espresso, when he heard the knock at his door. His private security, already informed by the doorman of the unexpected visitors, hesitated. "Open it," Sterling said calmly. When the officers stepped inside, they found a man who looked composed. Too composed. "Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for the murder of John Maxwell," the lead detective announced. Sterling didn't argue, didn't protest. Instead, he set down his coffee, removed his watch, and held out his wrists. His voice was eerily even. "I assume you have a warrant?" The detective nodded, snapping handcuffs around his wrists. Sterling smirked. "Then let's get this over with." As they led him out of his penthouse, cameras were already flashing in the streets below. The city's golden boy, the self-made billionaire, the philanthropist, was now a murder suspect, and his carefully curated empire was about to crumble. The trial was set to be one of the biggest in California's history. From the moment Richard Sterling was arrested, the media frenzy was unstoppable. News stations dissected every detail, his past, his business dealings, his relationship with John Maxwell. But it was in the courtroom where the real battle began. Sterling, dressed in a tailored navy suit, sat next to his high-powered legal team. His face was expressionless as prosecutors laid out the case against him. But when he finally spoke, the courtroom held its breath, because Richard Sterling had a defense, a shocking one. From the start, Sterling denied everything. Yes, he had been close to John Maxwell. Yes, John had been at his house that night. But no, he had not killed him. According to Sterling, a third party was responsible. Sterling's lawyers painted a new theory. John had been involved in something dangerous. He had made enemies outside his family, and the real killer had used Sterling as a scapegoat. His defense team claimed that the missing security footage had been hacked, not deleted by him. That the burner phone was planted to frame him. That the obsessive journal entries? Fabricated. The argument was clear. Richard Sterling wasn't a murderer. He was being set up. But the prosecution was ready, because the evidence told a very different story. The state's case against Richard Sterling was devastating. Prosecutors revealed something the public hadn't known. While analyzing the deleted texts from the burner phone, forensic experts had discovered voice memos, recordings that Richard Sterling had tried to erase. But nothing is ever truly deleted. One of those recordings was played in court. A voice, Sterling's voice, could be heard in a hushed, urgent tone. "You don't understand what's at stake. If you tell them, we both lose everything. You think they'll believe you over me?" The courtroom was silent as the words echoed through the speakers. It was the moment the jury realized this wasn't a setup. This wasn't a conspiracy. Richard Sterling had been trying to silence John Maxwell. Then came the forensic evidence. Experts testified that the skin cells found on the scratch bedpost in the guest room were a DNA match to John Maxwell. Even more damning, traces of Sterling's blood were found under John's fingernails, a sign of a struggle. A sign that John had fought for his life. The final blow came from an unexpected source. A former housekeeper from Sterling's estate, who had quit suddenly after John's disappearance, took the stand. She hesitated, glancing nervously at Sterling before speaking. That night, she'd overheard an argument. John had been yelling. Sterling's voice had been calm, but cold. Then, silence. The next morning, she was paid extra to leave early. And when she returned the following day, the guest room had been cleaned from top to bottom. Sterling's lawyers tried to discredit her, but the damage had already been done. It took the jury less than 3 hours to reach a decision. When the foreman stood, the room tensed. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Richard Sterling, guilty. Sterling didn't flinch, didn't blink. His face remained as impassive as it had been the day of his arrest. The judge delivered the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time, Sterling's mask cracked. For just a second, a flicker of realization crossed his face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The officers moved in to take him away, and just like that, his empire was over. The trial had exposed more than just a murder. It had forced society to confront difficult questions. How had someone as powerful as Richard Sterling hidden his crimes for so long? Had there been other victims before John? And how many people in his circle had looked the other way? Some refused to believe he was guilty. Conspiracy theories flooded the internet, claiming he had been framed. But for most, the truth was undeniable. The billionaire who had everything had thrown it all away to protect his darkest secret. And now, he would die behind bars. But there was one last twist, because in the weeks following the trial, something terrifying was uncovered. something that suggested that John Maxwell was never the first victim. And even worse, he might not have been the last. Richard Sterling had it all: money, power, influence. But in the end, none of it could hide the truth. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and speculation, now sat in complete silence as the judge delivered the final sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who built an empire, who commanded respect from the world's elite, was now nothing more than a prisoner. John Maxwell's life ended in the most tragic way possible, but his voice, his story, would never be silenced. A man who had everything: money, power, influence, threw it all away to hide his monstrous secret. But was John Maxwell his only victim? Or just the only one we know about? Because the most haunting part? No one knows if this was his first victim or his last. What do you think? Was justice truly served? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more shocking true crime stories, make sure to subscribe, because the next case is even more disturbing. The end.